Is it time for you to start tanking? Now, not everybody is a Giga Chad like Samiccus running his Blood DK through every single mob in the game, healing his dick off and doing the big boy things that I do every day. But maybe you can start to become a big boy. Maybe you can take on the responsibility of tanking. Maybe it's time for you to start tanking in the War Within. Let's see what Marcellian has to say.
Cannot find tanks for your group? No problem, watch this video. Tanks have been nerfed and they suck now? No problem,
They have been nerfed.
watch this video.
It's much harder.
You want to tank, but dying tactics routes and not getting people mad is a problem?
Gonna be a big...
I said no problem, watch this video. There's no surprise that you are getting ready for the first season of the War Within, and there are no tanks in sight. Neither are there healers, but one issue at a time. Maybe you wanted to give
well, that's the thing
tanking
about being a Giga Chad, though, is you are a rarity, right? You know, it's just comes with the territory. Not everybody can do the role that is required of a tank. You got to be, you're like a default leader. When you're a tank, people are just looking to you to lead. And it's not something everyone's comfortable with doing. But I will be honest, if you try it, you might actually like it. I first tried tanking in Shadowlands. Here I am, 3 expansions later now, still doing it because I love it.
try, or maybe you are just fed up with the lack of tanks and thought you can give it a go. Or maybe you are annoyed that you feel you have to tank or you will never get into groups in time. You shouldn't have to, but here we are. It's not that bad, let me tell you, and even if you are scared or simply refuse to take up the mantle, tanking might actually be way cooler than you think. So what do you stand to gain from tanking? Let me start by prefacing that I know
Here, I don't know what he's going to say right now, but what do you stand to gain? Massive ego boost. The ability to talk shit, unrelenting shit, knowing that most people are not going to say anything back because they're worried they're going to lose the tank and be thrown back into a queue. You also get insta-queues to basically everything. And whether warranted or not, you're given the title of leader. Like, it's just people look to you to lead. So, I mean, it's all positives. It's all positive. Ego stroking out the ass. It's just a great thing. But there are some negatives in that when the raid dies or when the group dies, a lot of times you're the one who's going to get blamed. That's for sure.
It sucks to not be able to play the spec you wanted to play and feel you need to swap roles. But I will also tell you why swapping roles will end up with you playing the spec you want on top of a lot of benefits you did not expect. Like dope-ass wallpapers with your character transmogs if you become a Patreon.
Yeah.
You'll also be supporting...
As a tank, when people blame you, you blame the healer. That's
videos like these among the entire Marcellian Online team. This content would be a lot less frequent and lower quality if it wouldn't be for the support of our patrons. Link is down below. Off the bat, tanking will push you into a different mindset, especially if you're coming from a DPS role. Let's go through these one at a time from most important to least. When you get into combat, the most important thing you need to accomplish is maintaining aggro. You might think it's surviving and you are not far off, but what's the point of surviving if you drop aggro and get your group killed one at a time? Aggro is important and it can be achieved in 2 main ways: deliberately and passively. Passively is when you are just doing your proper rotation and the sheer amount of DPS you have is enough to keep mobs and...
Well, that only works if you're playing a tanking spec that has a lot of DPS. If you're playing maybe Prot Warrior or Demon Hunter right now, then yeah, sure, you can use your damage. But if you're playing any other type of tank, I mean Blood DK or something else, you have to deliberately make sure you're grabbing aggro because your damage is not going to hold it, that's for sure.
Boss is glued to you. This is a privilege if it happens to be the case, and you will cherish it. It's also a somewhat bad thing because it teaches a lot of tanks bad habits. It's like relying on external power in the form of trinkets and legendaries as a DPS player, and it turns out that the game just plays itself for you instead you gaming the plays. You need to be aware and in control of your aggro, or when a nerf hits your tank or get an overgeared red paladin in your group, they will die every pull and you won't know why. The deliberate way of building aggro is the legit way. This means always pulling the boss with a taunt and whatever your pull ability is as a tank. The only time a DPS player dies at the start of the pull is if they didn't wait for the timer.
Basically if they're a hunter. If they're a hunter and they fucking shoot off that damn shot like while the countdown's still at 2, yeah, they're probably dead. And then you know what? That's not your fault as a tank. Don't feel bad. The hunters, it's just a mindset. It's a thing that they do. I don't know what it is.
Of course, taunt doesn't build aggro by itself. You still
Hopefully
have
they
to
feed
cast
that or
stuff
something.
during the time for it to be efficient. But of course, you knew that. In AoE scenarios, once you already have the mobs on you, you want to always rotate through your targets as you do damage. Bears want to spread their moonfires on everything. As a warrior, you will want to shield slam as many targets as possible to make sure there isn't one lonely mob in the pack you only hit with a few small cleave hits while your fire mage is mongoing on it like it just stole its car keys
Right.
and his dog is trapped in the locked car during August. If you don't do this, you will turn into one of those tanks that just randomly loses aggro mid-combat for some reason. It happens to everyone, don't worry. Tanks naturally do less damage than DPS, but their threat generation is higher. What does that mean? Well, as a very crude example, let's say that a DPS player generates 1 point of threat per point of damage. Tanks usually, depending on the tuning of the game, do several times that, which right now should be about 6.5 times higher. That means that for every point of damage, tanks do 6.5 points of threat. That means that as long as the DPS players don't out-damage you by 6.5 times, you'll never lose aggro, which conversely means that if there's a
If you're
machine...
dealing with like a crazy geared rep paladin, arcane mage, you know, shaman these days, that could happen. Just saying, they could really pop off early on, especially if you're like, as a tank, if you're like preparing to build up some aggro to start, and you're not really into your damage rotation for those first couple seconds, but this fucking arcane mage just literally splooged all over the boss, yeah, he might pull aggro. So just be aware of that. That's why you really do, instead of just using damage passively, you should be using your aggro mechanics, you know, taunts and things like that, to build up a big aggro cushion to start.
in your group that does
People are
7
gonna parse
times
early
your
on.
DPS, you will have to rotate taunts or something to keep mobs on you, since that DPS will generate more threat than you. The 6.5 times multiplier is just an example. It usually changes as tuning happens. What you need to remember is that damage is still important, and it naturally translates into aggro. The second most important thing is survivability. Now that you are successfully keeping aggro, meaning you are doing relatively good damage, you have to make sure you won't die. This is where the spec knowledge comes in, and since this is not a guide, I will just give examples instead of talking about all specs.
He said this is where spec knowledge comes in, but in all honesty, it's not just spec knowledge. It really is like fight knowledge, mechanic knowledge. Understanding, especially if you're raiding, knowing when the big hits are going to come, having things on cooldown that need to be off of cooldown so you can use them when you need to use them. You know, these kinds of things. Or just, you know, quick reaction time. Knowing like, oh shit, I just got double hit. I accidentally took that frontal and the hit from the boss at the same time. Mitigate, get through it, that kind of stuff. So there's a couple factors that go into this. It's rotation, it's understanding the fights, and it's reaction time.
At a time.
But it's one of the
As
funnest
a paladin,
things about
for instance,
tanking.
this means you have to always be in your consecration for that damage reduction buff, but also keep up your shield of the righteous.
DBM does help.
Past this, which is the generic active mitigation, you have cooldowns and words of glory. If your healer struggles to keep your HP bar up, or a big mechanic is about to happen, pop a defensive cooldown appropriate to what's happening. For instance, all of Paladin's defensives give damage reduction across the board. Warrior, however, has stuff like Spell Reflect, which can reflect spells but also give magic damage reduction. Death Knight has Anti-Magic Shell for obvious purposes.
Great.
This aspect of the game goes deeper, of course, and has a lot of factors into it which you will learn as you play. But for now, understanding the concept comes first. The third most important thing to do is what I like to call enabling your DPS. This means playing in a way where it's easy for your DPS players to destroy the encounter.
Yeah, part of that is, you know, facing a frontal in the correct direction, understanding boss positioning or mob positioning, pulling the right size groups in Mythic Plus. Like, yeah, there's a lot of things that you do as a tank it's kind of a thankless part of your job, in that you really do help DPS pump if you're doing things correctly.
This can range from positioning the boss and pack facing away from your group to not force them to dodge unnecessary frontals.
I didn't pre-watch this, I
Controlling
just
as
tank.
much
I
as
fucking
possible
know.
to not force your DPS to break their rotation to CC, and so on. Yes, I understand that a lot of mules just charge in, eyes closed and fingers crossed, and eat all the tank frontals, or will never use CC or interrupt casts at all. It sucks, but you, together with your healer, are actual babysitters for your DPS players. They don't know that, or will ever admit it, since it's already so hard to combust in the pack that they forgot they even have bloodlust. It's okay. you won't forget because you are clearly the better person. Jokes aside, good tanks do indeed do this. Not all tanks, of course, but a good tank that keeps the pack in the rain of fire is hard to come by, and trust me.
Well, yeah, right. Alex, you make a good point. A mistake I've done before. Do not give your back to the boss ever, or whoever you are fighting. Thank you, Alex, for the 100 bits after the insult. I do appreciate that. Yeah, don't give your back to the boss. You will take more damage. It is an actual thing. And I learned this very early on in tanking, is that you will take more damage from getting hit from behind. So you got to learn to strafe. Strafe your dick off. And what I mean by strafing is you diagonally run. You are essentially running in the direction you want to, but you're doing it diagonally, right? By holding like Q or E plus the forward movement button on your keyboard, rather than turning around and running straight. That's how you avoid taking back damage.
Me, if you do that, your warlocks will 100% notice, even if they won't say it. You will make friends. Next in line is the fourth best thing, and that is considering your healer. This is a bit abstract because it relies on each spec individually that you play and the spec that your healer plays. Generally, this means to use defensives a bit more, even if normally you should be healed through the damage that you take. This means definitely using a strong defensive or heal if you notice someone in your party not dodging a mechanic and almost dying, immediately forcing the healer to respond. This means helping with affixes, dispels, and other responsibilities that will 100% make the job harder for your healer if left unchecked, when everyone else is already taking so much damage. Don't get it twisted. If by the time the season starts, dungeons and maybe raids as well don't get massive tuning passes for the damage people take, the content will be likely very punishing.
Obviously, you know, it's all going to matter more early in a season, right? The less geared people are, the more under-tuned everything is. It's gonna be tough early on, and then as things get better, you can become more lax with your tanking. But certainly right now, if you're taking Mythic Plus or Heroic Raid or something, you are tanking your dick off. That's for sure.
Not least, as with everything in life, really, be open to criticism if you want to improve and make your runs easier, of course. It would be ideal if the criticism is constructive, but it won't always be. And it sucks when it isn't. But people are people and you can't change them. You can, however, change how you process the criticism. And if a DPS is saying that you suck for losing aggro, maybe you didn't actually suck. Maybe you pulled the Grim Battle pack with the Overseer, targeted the Overseer Lieutenant, as you should since you are not a Muppet, while the DPS went zug-zug on a random caster, pulled aggro, and
that's right, it's the DPS's fault, it's not your fault, always.
In between kicks, they got meleeed and died. The takeaway might be to rotate your big damage abilities occasionally on all mobs of the pack in case people just target whichever one the tab button selects first. Why do all this then? Well, this whole discussion started from the fact that you couldn't get into groups.
True.
But now you can, since you are the tank. Well, first of all, you get to play the game. Second, since tanks are a rarity, the chances of people adding you after a good run are way higher, and slowly you will build a group of people you will do content with. Once you have a stable group, the chances of you playing a DPS or something else are higher, since friends usually do that for each other. Not to mention, having an actual group means you don't need to wait in LFG. This can also mean the same thing for a guild.
Yeah, when it comes to making groups, it's an obvious plus. Yes, you're always going to get groups very quickly. Also, you're typically going to be invited to higher level content, even if you're slightly undergeared. Whereas DPS really do need to be almost overgeared at times to do certain pieces of content. When you're a tank, desperate times lead to desperate measures. And a lot of times people will invite you to do content that you're typically undergeared for, which means you will usually gear out your tanking, whatever class you're playing as a tank, more quickly than you will your DPS specs.
Some of the best players out there started pugging content until they got into a group that invited them into their actual guild, and blammo! Now they have people to do content with. Outside of this, the reality remains that tanking and healing are way less popular than DPSing, and will remain that way likely forever. You can start tanking now, get to do more content, make friends that will let you rotate to another role, or get into a guild that does the same. Or it could mean you'll just be a tank for now. But is that bad? Well, tanks will mostly play like a DPS player, but actually a DPS on steroids gameplay-wise. What do I mean by that? Well, once you get into the habit of rotating your defensives and active...
I will also say, if you like to play solo content in the game, maybe you're enjoying delves a lot or something, like you are a solo player, playing as a tank does make things easier, I feel like. Like, you really don't need other people to do a lot of solo content. Like, when it comes to a world boss or something, like, I'll see DPS standing around, just waiting for somebody to show up. I'll show up, fucking 2 people are standing by the world. I'll just pull it. I don't give a shit. I'm not gonna die. I'll be fine. And then people will eventually show up and kill the boss with me. But like, you don't have to wait for people to do things a lot of times. Even when you're questing, you're really not gonna die. Doing a delve, you're not gonna die. So yeah, in terms of like being a solo player, if you are one, maybe try tanking. It might be the best way to play solo.
Mitigation, which is something extra nobody else does, all that is left for you is to DPS. And usually that is what tanking comes down to once you know what you're doing. This is how you get tanks in groups that out DPS the actual damage dealers. This is how you get tanks in the group that, despite the tank nerfs, don't die while everyone else does the walk of shame back to the pack. This is how you improve.
With the time Sam ran a delve and died, yeah, you talk about the time where I was 25 item levels lower than the recommended item level for a fucking tier 8 delve, and I still completed it only with 1 death. And that was because the damn spores one-shotted me because I was clearly undergeared. You talk about that one, Moishi? You little bitch. Yeah, I remember that one too. Yeah, I'll tank as a sub-titty rogue. Yeah, you could.
As a player. Not saying that non-tanks are bad players, but people that never try other roles will always have a limited understanding of the game. Accepting the additional responsibility will increase your skill set and make you a better player. And if you do decide to go back to DPSing, you can apply to groups with newly formed wisdom acquired from your tanking experience and add it to your application. True. I know not to stay in frontals, or I know not to pull before the tank, or not steal aggro, or use CCs when the tank needs to kite. I bet you anything more tanks will apply to your group or invite you to theirs that way, since they finally found someone that knows their struggle. And most importantly, tanks are bosses, dude. People can whine all they want, but if you are the tank, you decide when the combat starts.
That's right.
You decide where it goes. You decide how fast or big it becomes. In the words of the immortal Snap, you got the power.
That's
Grab
true.
the power by its nuts and pick the right race for your class. We went through the best combinations of races for all classes in the game with winners and losers right here, so check it out.
Yeah, great video, and everything he said is very much true. And if you think like, oh, I don't got what it takes, you know, I can never be like Samiccus, the guy's a fucking legend. Well, you just try it. Give it a try. I think you'll be surprised. That tanking really isn't that complicated. Eventually, you'll get really good at, you know, damage mitigating at the proper times and doing the right things and learning the fights. And who knows? You might become the next Samiccus, you know, legend of tanks. The unkillable. The blood DK. Who knows?